Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining me here today for this very interesting topic because there are so many people who are interested in working with childhood trauma and how it affects our lives. In order to help our clients, in order to help people heal from their childhood wounds, we should explore more, read more, and research about this topic, because we have all experienced traumas and familiar emotions like anger, guilt, shame, hate, pain, aggression, fear. And let's start with trauma. Trauma is an emotional response to traumatic events, horrible events like experiencing accidents, experiencing death of a loved one, experiencing abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or another form of abuse like neglect. Because neglect is also known as invisible abuse, and it's very, very damaging and painful. Neglect can also be expressed as physical or emotional neglect, but there is also bullying that can cause traumas. Trauma is valid even if it has happened long time ago, even if it doesn't really impact you anymore, even if your symptoms don't look like someone else's symptoms, even if it took you a while to realize that what you have experienced was trauma. And even if someone told you that it wasn't a big deal, and even if you can't remember it properly, it was trauma and you should be aware of that. You shouldn't be denying. There are many symptoms of trauma, like insomnia, muscle tension, pain, aches, fatigue, withdrawing from others and isolating yourself, trying to hide yourself in order to avoid pain, in order to avoid being hurt ever again. Surviving trauma can significantly increase the risks for developing mental health disorders later in life. Experiencing trauma can increase the risk for developing psychosis, obsessive-compulsive disorder, borderline personality disorder, conditions like anxiety or depression, also experiencing many forms of health issues because of the stress that we are exposed to during our trauma. Surviving psychological trauma can definitely contribute to developing mental health disorder and being diagnosed of mental disorder later in life. And conditions like anxiety and depression are typical for people who have experienced emotional abuse in their childhood and who have experienced emotional trauma. And this shows up in their adolescence because they become very depressed and anxious. There are many forms of experiencing trauma, but let's mention those who are the most important ones, like experiencing sexual abuse as children, or experiencing physical, emotional, mental abuse. And this can lead to changes in our brain. There are changes caused by trauma that are physical changes, but not because of the physical injury to the brain, but because there are functional and structural changes in our brain. Because our brain has the power to activate the survival mode when we experience trauma, and we disattach from our emotions in order to survive And this amazing strategy of our brain is controlled by our reptilian brain. And when we experience trauma, we experience it with our senses. What we hear can be horrible. What we see can be very painful. And if we smell alcohol, for example, all these sensory informations are stored in our reptilian brain. And this is how we are triggered sometimes. If we are triggered by certain situations, this means that we definitely need healing and we need to work on our past trauma. After experiencing traumatic event, traumatic stress can go in one of two ways. Either the survivor feels too much and feels overwhelmed, or the survivor feels very little and feels emotionally numb. The stress hormones give the body and our brain the energy when our reptilian brain activates the survival mode. And we become addicted to this adrenaline hormone, this energy that we need in order to survive the traumatic event. We become addicted to reliving the trauma, and we activate the long-term stress response. And this feels that we are in a heightened state of anxiety, and we are constantly in this emergency mode. We're expecting and anticipating danger. This means that we become addicted to negative thoughts, negative expectations, fear, and worry constantly. This also means that we unconsciously but purposefully begin to use our trauma, our pain, our past as a source of adrenaline hormone. And eventually this becomes a part of our personality trait, because this becomes our integrity, becomes who we are, because moment by moment we're creating this with our thoughts. And integrity means that what we think, what we say, how we feel, and how we behave is all in alignment. And people think that it is much better to feel anything in order to avoid to feel numb and to feel empty. So people unconsciously choose to feel this anger, guilt, shame, because this gives them something to feel. And it's much better to feel than feeling empty. And people also, in a certain way, create emotional relationship with their past, with their problems, because each stress makes our body out of balance, and many of our emotions are derived from the hormones of stress. Emotions like guilt, anger, hate, aggression, fear, anxiety, depression, insecurity, powerlessness, hopelessness. And these are all familiar emotions to us. Unlike animals who can activate short-term stress response in order to survive danger, humans are in a different position because they turn on the long-term stress response even if there is no danger. And this is how we continuously expose ourselves to stress with our thoughts, with our beliefs, and we can activate the genes that are responsible for creating illnesses in our body. For example, autoimmune disease, illnesses. And after experiencing the traumatic event, people can develop post-traumatic stress disorder, or there is another phenomenon that happens, post-traumatic growth. When people experience post-traumatic stress disorder, it is actually the response to the trauma. And PTSD is driven by remarkable dysfunction in brain areas vital to processing the fear and creating the fear response. People exposed to trauma are less able to suppress unwanted emotional memories because there are neural and behavioral disruptions in their brain. And this contributes to the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. Patients with PTSD can complete the same task as someone without exposure to trauma when no emotion is involved. However, when emotion invoked by a threat was added to a similar task to the group of people who have experienced PTSD, they couldn't perform the same tasks successfully because there was emotion involved. And the researchers have found that there are less signaling between the hippocampus, and hippocampus is the area of the brain that is responsible for memory and emotion, and the salience network responsible for learning and survival. That's actually the mechanism for survival. They also detected less signaling between the amygdala and the default mode network. And this is the area of the brain that activates when someone isn't focused on the outside world. Because in order to survive trauma, we need to be focused on the inside world. What happens inside of us? How do we survive? What do we say? What do we do? Do we need to run? Do we need to fight? And there is also something very interesting about experiencing childhood trauma, and it is related to beating the children and physical abuse, corporal punishment, because the researchers conducted a study on 149 boys and girls between the ages of 11 and 14. And participants performed a video game while undergoing continuously recorded EEG, non-invasive technique to measure brainwave activity from a scalp. And from EEG data, the researchers determined two scores for each participant. One was neural response to fear, and the other one was neural response to reward. And they have determined less signaling and less signaling and less response when someone who has experienced corporal punishment is able to receive reward and praise. And they're not that excited about being rewarded, being successful, being praised, but they're more responsive to when they make a mistake, to when they do something wrong. And people who have experienced trauma are trying to process this and to find some meaning of what happened to them. And they start analyzing the situation. They start analyzing themselves and how have they contributed to this situation and this trauma. And in general, the ability to make sense of tragedy and then benefit in it is the key that unlocks post-traumatic growth. Because one study of trauma survivors shows that after experiencing the traumatic event, people can experience post-traumatic growth. And in certain circumstances, our mind can grow from difficulty. Our mind can grow from experiencing trauma because our psychological functioning increases after we experience a challenge. In other words, in certain circumstances, our mind can grow from difficulty. And this phenomenon was discovered by the researchers Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Colomb. They have discovered that post-traumatic growth can happen after someone experiences trauma. When someone experiences trauma that is caused by a car crash or being emotionally abused by their partner in the relationship, being diagnosed with a serious health condition, or a death of a loved one. So post-traumatic stress disorder is something that is very incapacitating, and it means reliving the trauma over and over again, having flashbacks, and it feels that it's happening over and over again because persons who have PTSD reflect the inability to effectively distinguish differences between what is safe and what is not. And they're constantly trying to see danger in everyone and everything. They're expecting that it's not safe to trust anyone, but they also don't trust themselves. For example, they think that it is not safe to trust themselves in making the right decisions in life. And when we need to do the healing, we need to go to a professional, and rapid transformational therapy can really do miracles for people who have been experiencing continuous trauma in their childhood in many forms, because some people have experienced multiple forms of trauma: emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and they need to work on that. When people experience PTSD, they need more sessions. They need to work on this issue a couple of months before they can completely heal. And sometimes in the sessions, when they have one scene, they also have a second scene coming and mixing, because this is very interesting. It goes back to the time and day when they experience trauma, because when people experience trauma after the traumatic event, they feel mixed emotions. For example, they can feel guilt and they can feel relief after experiencing a car accident, because they feel guilt, the survival guilt, because they have survived and someone else unfortunately didn't. But they also feel relieved because they have survived, they have another chance for life. And these mixed emotions are something that should be resolved in our sessions. And people feel confused by these emotions, and they also have conflicting beliefs. They believe that they're happy, they were lucky to survive the car accident, but they also feel guilty, and somehow they feel shame. Other emotions caused by trauma can be sadness, feeling enormous sadness for a long period of time, for years and decades. Especially the children who were physically abused, they develop depression and this enormous sadness. They also feel disbelief, and also anger, a lot of anger. They have outbursts of anger and rage, and this can also be resolved with RTT therapy. Sometimes people feel emotionally numb because after experiencing the traumatic event, after losing someone they loved, or experiencing something that changed their life dramatically, they make a decision: I don't want to feel anything because I can never survive this ever again. I could never survive to lose a loved one, a partner, a husband, and they cannot make connections, relationships. They have difficulties because they cannot express emotions and they cannot receive emotions from other people who love them, from their family, from their friends. And they disconnect from everyone because they feel and they believe that this is safe and this is going to protect them for the rest of their lives. Sometimes people believe that they need to make sacrifices in order to be accepted or in order to avoid rejection, because they believe that this is something they need to do in order to find connections and avoid rejection. And also they believe sometimes when they lose friendships and when they cannot trust themselves or their mother, their father, their brother, they think, if I can't trust my family, then I cannot trust myself in making a good judgment of people and forming long-lasting relationships or friendships. So they form a certain belief, and this belief says, whenever I have friends, they become my enemies. And when you ask them in therapy, I want you to tell me, who was your friend and became your enemy? Who has disappointed you in your life and taught you to believe this? And they say, well, my mother hurt me, she rejected me, she didn't want to have me, or I was a girl, she wanted a boy. And they have this belief, okay, if my mother cannot accept me and love me, how can my friend accept me and love me unconditionally? And if they have this belief, they're going to behave in a certain way in their friendships. They're not going to be very trustful. They're not going to expect that this friendship is going to last forever. And maybe they're not even going to invest in a good, positive way in that relationship with friends. And this is how people contribute to their own failure, because they have negative, limiting, old, dysfunctional beliefs. And those beliefs maybe had a role, function, and purpose at one point in their life after experiencing trauma. But after decades of living with this belief, they realize that something is wrong, that their life is not the way it should be, and they're not happy, and they don't know what's wrong. But they cannot resolve this problem, this belief, from the conscious level. They need to be hypnotized, because their subconscious mind can reveal so many different connections and interpretations between what happened to them and what made them feel, think in a certain way. And sometimes people believe, I'm not capable, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart, and they're afraid to go after their dreams and goals. They procrastinate because they're afraid of failure. Because, for example, maybe when they were in school, their teacher said that they're stupid, and the whole class laughed because the person couldn't read well and pronounce words. And they formed this belief that they're not capable of even reading and expressing their opinions. They're not confident about themselves. And what we need to do is explore. Okay, if you have this belief, I'm not capable, you ask your client, repeat after me. I'm not capable because, and they tell you what is the reason. And then you say, repeat after me, I'm not capable, and this makes me know. And this is how you discover emotions, the group of emotions, and you discover the group of their beliefs that are connected to this basic belief, I'm not capable. And they will tell you, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not smart. And when you explore when this all happened, it will lead to bullying or childhood trauma or feeling invisible or being emotionally neglected by their parents. And children are very often emotionally neglected by their parents because their parents are emotionally unavailable. They don't see their kids, they don't hear them, they don't let them have their voice and express their opinion. And this is called the invisible abuse because there are no bruises, there are no scars, but there is pain. There is emotional damage that the child experiences from their parent or their caregiver. And this affects them very deeply because they think, if my own parent cannot love me, spend time with me, if my parent doesn't love me or want me, then no one else will ever love me. Or they have this expectation, how could I ever find someone to love me if my own parent cannot love me? So, talking about childhood trauma and healing from childhood trauma is a very, very interesting and important, very relevant topic, because if you want to help your clients to release all the blocks and all negative, old, limiting beliefs that are holding them back, you need to also talk to them and in a way mentor them, explain them with stories, with examples, how can they progress with their healing. You need to explain them that RTT sessions are amazing and they can help them heal and release. But also the audio recording, the transformational audio recording is very important because it helps them rewire their brain. It helps them use the biological potential of their brain to form new neural pathways and to form new beliefs, new mechanisms and strategies of surviving, of becoming resilient, emotionally resilient, mentally resilient, and to see their life and their potential, their full potential from a different perspective. And let me look at the time. Okay, maybe now is the time for questions. Do you have questions for me? Yes, exactly. I agree. Trauma-informed coaching is also good following and in between RTT sessions. Yes, this is what I mentioned. Yes, mentoring or coaching people, teaching them with different stories, examples from your own practice, from the practice of your RTT colleagues, and also reading the scientific news, Psychology Today, neuroscience, and informing yourself and trying to explain to them in a simple language what they should expect from themselves and how much potential they have, and they're usually not even aware of that. Okay, thank you. I would love to see an affinity group that is specifically on dealing with PTSD, okay? Yeah, this is great. Someone said, I do mindset sessions, following RTT sessions every 10 days. Yes, this is very good because you're really empowering your clients and you're really helping them to continuously heal and grow and transform themselves. And they can only do it if they're willing to be committed to listening to the audio recording, to listen to your advice. Maybe sometimes they can have their journals and they can write all the changes they have experienced, the emotions, and what happens in their dreams. Do they have nightmares after the session? Are there new memories, suppressed emotional memories that were triggered with the session? And then you can decide if you need another session. Oh yes, yeah, emotional neglect is very, very often and happens almost to everyone, because we could all remember of the times when we felt invisible and when we felt that we're not good enough, we're not interesting enough, that we asked too many questions. Okay,